This video provides an overview of Chapter 17, the West and the South. The chapter deals with essentially two topics: Western American expansion in the late 1800s and conditions in the African American South. So the textbook talks about the acquisition of land in the West and how it was being subdivided into states, and it talks about how people came into the West following various paths and on the railroad. A significant part of the chapter describes the economy of the West, and the major economic activities going on in the West were mining, ranching, and agriculture. Each of these three activities were dominated by big businesses. It was very difficult for the little guy to compete with the economies of scale that the big businesses enjoyed. So, for instance, this small miner here could not at all compete with big companies that had large machines that could hydraulically mine, just blast the side out of mountains, or drill down deep into the earth. So mining became big business. Cattle ranching, very similarly. Ranchers that could afford large plots of land that it could mark off with barbed wire were becoming the dominant force in ranching. And the same was true of agriculture. Small families like these simply could not compete with big businesses that farmed huge plots of land with giant machines and again enjoyed the profits of the economies of scale. For minorities living in the West, Mexicans found themselves falling down the social hierarchy. In 1848, they dominated the political, economic, and social life in the Southwest. Men like Pio Pico and Sepulveda were very wealthy and powerful. But with the conquest by the United States and the arrival of a growing number of Americans, Mexicans fell into a lower status and became an exploited labor force. The textbook talks in great detail about the final defeat of the Indians by the 1890s, and it talks about the different battles and how African Americans resisted. The Chinese living in the West also found themselves discriminated against. They came west to mine, but after a tax was imposed on foreign miners, many of them went on to work in other jobs, like very dangerous and low-paid work of building the railroad. They established laundries to fit an unmet need to have laundry done, and they predominantly lived in Chinatowns. Chinatowns were an advantage because they eased transition into American life. It was there where you could speak Chinese, read Chinese, eat Chinese food, and feel comfortable. But there were also massacres periodically within Chinatowns where mobs of whites would enter into Chinatown, burn down buildings, and attack the Chinese. So in this political cartoon, we see the Chinese depicted as a cat, and it starts off as a cute little innocent kitty, and the country has invited them in, and eventually it grows until it destroys the very people who had helped it. This sort of discrimination led to the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which restricted Chinese immigration. So the reality of the South was not this. This is an idealized vision of America coming west with transportation technology, steam engines, with communication technology, the telegraph wire. They're coming west to build and make the land productive. They're chasing the savage Indians off the land. She has a book that could represent democracy or learning, or the Bible. But all of this really was an inaccurate description of a very difficult place to live. African Americans in this time period faced the systematic use of the legal system to oppress them economically, politically, and socially. Segregation was enforced in public spaces like the railroad. It was justified by a stereotype of Jim Crow as being kind of silly, easy-go-lucky, never wanting responsibility. So if you believed, and you would wrongfully believe, that this is how all African Americans were, then that would justify not giving them a vote, or not allowing them to go to school, or not giving them a job promotion. The other thing that reinforced this is Plessy versus Ferguson, which was a Supreme Court decision that created the precedent for segregation. Much of the work that African Americans did was work that they had done during slavery, although now for a wage. So doing laundry, working as domestic servants, watching children, cleaning kitchens. And most African Americans ended up in farming. And they did not own the land, they farmed somebody else's land in a system called sharecropping. And be sure to read that section of the textbook carefully. And they were also the targets of violent retaliation if they showed any complaint or any capacity to move up the social stratification. Preachers were frequent targets because the church provided an avenue for African Americans to move up the social hierarchy. So disenfranchisement also occurred. The vote was taken away methodically. Here we can see, the Ku Klux Klan and the violence that they imposed upon the South. The vote was taken away with things like the poll tax, understanding clauses, literacy tests, and ultimately violent intimidation. African Americans resisted this through the Knights of Labor, which struggled for equal pay for African Americans, and also through things like the boycott proposed by Ida B. Wells, separatism or Back to Africa movement led by Henry McNeil Turner, or the classic battle between Du Bois and Washington. Du Bois saying that the African Americans should really struggle to allow its most talented people to rise to the top, and then they could affect the changes that needed to be in place to create equality. Booker T. Washington said, we need to be happy with where we are. We don't need any more than we already have. Let's just work hard and prove ourselves to whites. Thank you for listening to this Chapter 17 overview.